Hello, Firebirds. Nice to see you. Actually, easier to picture you now that we've had one live session. I can see all your little Zoom boxes. Makes it a little easier to feel connected. Let's start this asynchronous session with a challenge. What do you suppose we would choose as the single key idea to start with? What is so important that we want to put it in first place amongst the thousands of things we're going to think about and should think about in our teaching and learning? What is the most important starting place? What do you think we chose? Got a good answer? Well, here's my answer. Assumptions. Yep. Those assumptions you carry in you, whether consciously or not, about what makes for good teaching. We all carry these assumptions. We develop them by observation of other teachers, by instruction in many cases, and certainly by experience of the way that we were taught. In fact, most teachers base a lot of their decisions on the ways they taught and learned. Assumptions are beliefs or propositions that are taken for granted and accepted as true without requiring proof or evidence. They're often unconscious, but we make 1,000 teaching decisions based on them. We decide what should be in a lesson plan. We decide what's the most important idea to share. We respond in a particular moment of teaching that's a surprise based on our assumptions. And they may not always be the best way to teach in order to accomplish aims, destinations. That's why we examine them. Let me give you a couple of examples outside of music of assumptions. One simple one that is widely held is that human memory is like a video camera. We kind of just assume that what you see with your eyes is recorded accurately and can be reported back and relied on, even though this has been totally disproven by psychologists and neuroscientists. It's totally not true. But there are consequences to false assumptions. There are a whole lot of people in prison based on a court's belief that an eyewitness's memory was like a video recording. It was an accurate memory, when in fact it wasn't, and innocent people languish in jail. Here's another assumption that drives me personally crazy, which is the myth of meritocracy. A lot of people believe, especially people with privilege, that your success in the world is determined largely by your skill and your intelligence and your effort. Those of us who work with young people who haven't had a fair chance in life sure know that isn't true, that there are all kinds of systemic barriers for people rising to greater success. And that's what brings us together, because we want to address those barriers and give opportunities for young people to rise through their own merit. Remember that part of the AIM mission statement that says, "Together we challenge the status quo." Assumptions confirm the status quo. They hold the status quo in place. And if we're going to get better at teaching for youth development, we're going to have to challenge some of those assumptions and adopt new assumptions to become more effective in our teaching. I first became aware of this through the work of the education psychologist Howard Gardner. You may have heard of him. He's American. He is the developer of the theory of multiple intelligences, which had such a big effect on education in the US in the 20th century. His theory was we have more than two kinds of intelligence, mathematical and verbal, the ones that are most often tested. We have 8 different kinds of intelligence, And different people have a different mix of them, and one of them is musical intelligence. Anyway, Gardner had another theory called teaching for understanding. Based on his research, he generalized that by about age 6, just about every kid has a complete understanding of how everything works. Based in experience and observation, they pretty much have a naive beginner's understanding about everything. Their naive understanding about physics comes from the number of times they threw food off their plate and watched what happened to it. They have their naive understanding about how people relate to each other from observing how people relate, from their own interactions and attempts at manipulating other people. So he said, with those naive understandings, young people go to school and they start having information applied in school and out of school and by people they know. They get a pile of information based on the same understandings until they encounter something that isn't based on information they've been taught, and they default to the same naive understanding they had at age 6. He did this amazing set of experiments with people who had PhDs in physics, professional physicists in the laboratory. You know, they had the same naive understandings that 6-year-olds have about physics, and they piled, I don't know, 14 years of education and study and learning in the world on top of that. And when he asked them questions about physics that weren't based on information they were taught, but required that they apply their understandings of physics, many of them gave the same wrong answers that 6-year-olds did. So it becomes essential to educate the understandings of people. And he's developed schools across the country, teaching for understanding schools, where they focus on developing understandings and not just pouring in more information. And here's the simple way that you teach an understanding, according to Gardner. The learner must recognize the existing understanding they have. And there may be something to do there because many of them are unconscious. So you surface a clear understanding. You then must see it in direct relationship with a more satisfying, more truthful understanding. And then you must apply that new understanding. That's how it works. Surface a clarity about an existing understanding you carry, juxtapose it to a more satisfying understanding, something that seems more true, and then apply that new assumption to test it out and see how it works. And it's not a one-shot miracle. This cycle has to happen a number of times to educate that assumption. So you're starting to carry a new assumption into the hundreds of decisions we make. So part of AIM's work is to unlearn assumptions that may be unconsciously banging around in your head. So we will surface assumptions, we'll challenge them to see if there's more satisfying ones, and then AIM is about experimentation. Let's take a few examples from music education and see what they might look like in that paradigm. Here's one you may have inside of you to some degree, that you have to have reasonable skill on your instrument before you can do much that's musically interesting or original. Boy, did I encounter that a lot around Juilliard. You have to be reasonably good on your instrument before you can do much that's really musically interesting or original. Was that embedded in your musical learning journey? If so, it might appear in a moment when a student is complaining about being bored or asking if they could do something a different way, and you start to talk about you need discipline, or you start to say, well, we'll get to that before long. That's that assumption at work. And does that really work for your students? Is that really the best way to achieve those destinations? What does it tell them? It tells them it's going to be a long time before you can start doing things that are interesting or satisfying. And many of them are going to think, I don't want to do that. That's not for me. This isn't my game. I don't want it bad enough. So we need to examine that assumption and think about a different one. In fact, what if the opposite were true? Think about that moment when a kid is invited to pluck a string of a viola for the first time. You've seen it. And this kind of giddy delight at the power of that moment and how fun it is and how great it feels. Can we extend that across a learning journey? I have a music educator friend whose mission in his teaching is to figure out how to set up the preparation so the first time a student draws a bow across a string on a violin, that student hears nothing but a beautiful success, that it's an ecstatic moment, not a screechy sound that says it's going to take you a whole long time before you can do anything good on this thing. What if the assumption were that everybody can do musically interesting, musically original things right from the beginning of their musical journey, and that we can build a whole learning process that includes the development of necessary skills through the pleasure and delight and discovery of a different assumption? Is that possible? Let's find out together in AIM. All of us carry assumptions from long, proud lineages of music education. Many of us have actually been taught in certain ways. AIM invites us to make sure those are the best ways. Maybe they weren't dedicated to the students we're teaching. And maybe those assumptions weren't thinking about the 5 destinations that AIM prioritizes. Let's make sure our assumptions don't just work for some kids, because AIM believes our work can work for all kids. Here's another assumption. This is one that drives me a little bit crazy. What assumption is in place that leads teaching artists to talk so much in their musical teaching? Why is that the overwhelming pattern in the teaching of so many? What assumption does that spring from? I've observed classes where teaching artists in music are talking 95% of the time. Is that really the best way to build those social capacities in our destinations? What if the alternative were that many, maybe most things that are important in learning music can be taught from inside music, and that the things that need to be talked about can be talked about? But what if we were to flip that priority and believe that, in fact, most of the important things can be done from inside music and not with direct instruction, because that's what we assume is the way to do it? And here's a third example, one that AIM faces a lot, and that is that group social impact music instruction, where the focus is on social development. That social development takes time away from essential musical instruction and reduces the musical progress. We encounter this a lot with more traditional thinkers. They think, yeah, well, if you want to develop agency and, self-esteem and all that stuff, that's great. But you have to stop teaching music in order to do that. And consequently, you get mediocre musicians. Our belief in AIM, our alternative assumption, is that, in fact, those social capacities can be taught inside musical instruction. And in fact, doing that takes you further and faster in musical results. That if you have young people that are developing holistically and strengthening their intrinsic motivation, they're hungry to succeed, they're developing agency, and their own artistic voices are arising and they're working well in community, that takes them further in musical advancement. That's what AIM is out to experiment with. I have a little project for you now. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause this recording while you enter some ideas in your learning journal. I'm going to ask you to apply the ideas about challenging assumptions. So I'm going to ask you to identify an assumption that you carry about teaching and learning in music that might not be the best for student social development. Find one assumption you carry, name it succinctly, try out an alternative. What might be a different assumption that would more effectively move toward those 5 destinations? And then a few lines for what that might look like in your teaching practice with your students. So that's the challenge. Surface an assumption and name it concisely. Name an alternative assumption that you have a hunch might be a more effective way to achieve the outcomes of the destinations. And then a few sentences of what you could see yourself doing that would enact that new assumption. Don't take a whole lot of time with this, 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, and then start back up the recording and we'll pick up from there. Here's the assignment on the screen. See you in about 5 or 10 minutes. So, welcome back. We've looked at developing new assumptions, new understandings that could underlie our teaching choices toward those 5 destinations. And we hear from people inside AIM and outside AIM that those 5 destinations may be the most powerful thing AIM has introduced to the field. That instead of having 20 definitions of success and 25 different ways that people think they should do their teaching, how about 5? How about a consistent, irreducible core set of 5 outcomes we want for our students, and then collective investigation of new assumption, new methodologies to achieve those 5 destinations? One of the ways we unfold those 5 destinations is in a rubric. I don't know if you know about rubrics. We'll show you a couple of examples, but it is a tool used widely in professional learning, certainly widely across education, but also in many other professional fields. It can look like a boring table. In fact, people in the arts often find it like they want to run screaming in the other direction. But we find that you'll warm up pretty quickly when you find out how useful it is to have the broad ideas of AIM pulled together in language as tight as we can make it. And you and your coach will be using the AIM rubric to really help guide your development in a really objective way. So let's take a glance at part of the rubric. We're going to introduce it a part at a time so it doesn't become too overwhelming, but you'll get used to this over time. We're going to take a look at just the first part that deals with the first destination of holistic learning. I'm bringing it up on my screen. So we've got in one column, holistic development as a destination, where young people learn to value themselves as whole, capable individuals. Yeah, we want that. And then we have 2 columns, aspects of student outcomes. This is what it looks like. This is what we would love to see students develop. And the column next to it is what the Firebird actually does to produce that outcome, to move toward that outcome. Remember, our 3 aspects for holistic development are self-esteem, self-regulation, and physical health. These first 3 in the column describe what those outcomes look like in our students. And let me read them. And I hope as you're hearing these words, you're thinking, yeah, That sounds pretty great. I would want that for all of my students. Students are confident in their value as a person and believe they are competent and deserve happiness. They are they treat themselves kindly, identify and express their needs appropriately, see both their strengths and weaknesses, have appropriate expectations, say no when necessary, and feel they belong. Want that for our students. An outcome of self-esteem they bring to music, they learn through music, and bring to the world. And the second one, self-regulation. A lot of us encounter students who don't have much of this, so we have to focus on it. Students are aware of and take care to manage their own emotional balance. They can be present and bring their full selves to learning, self-reflect, and come back easily from distractions and know how to seek help when needed. Wouldn't that be great if all of our students could develop it? You may want to experiment with your colleagues in the FAR lab, with other Firebird fellows, with your coach, to find out how to develop those capacities. And physical health, absolutely essential for all of our students. Students are aware of and take care to manage their own physical health in music making and situations that are fundamental to artistic expression and social connectedness. So I hope you feel a resonance with those and think, yes, I want that for my students. And then there's the column of what a Firebird does, the inputs from the teacher that lead in that direction. And let's read those. To achieve self-esteem for students, the Firebird sees and treats every student as an asset, a fully capable, valuable, essential contributor to the group. Every student is an asset. The Firebird recognizes and openly acknowledges students who are learning to value themselves, creating a safe and aspiring musical community of belonging, achievement, and active appreciation of all their students. That's the community, that's the environment a Firebird tries to develop, and the result is greater self-esteem for students. And self-regulation. Here's a way of describing what the Firebird does. The Firebird creates an environment that builds habits of student reflection and awareness of their inner emotional and mental state. That's what you do. What does that look like in practice? And that encourages self-management and attention control. The Firebird encourages students to ask for help and uses effective strategies to bring students respectfully and discreetly back from distractions or unregulated behaviors. There's a whole lot of stuff in there that we unpack when we have time and that you can experiment with the how of it. In fact, some of the micro strategies we'll offer you are ways that you can practice developing self-regulation in your students. And finally, physical health. The Firebird commits to habits of healthy music making, posture, and relaxation in playing and singing, utilizing tried and tested techniques and exercises, setting a high expectation for natural and comfortable posture, and regularly adjusting posture and technique to reinforce good habits and body awareness. You may already be doing that, but we want to make sure we're prioritizing it so students have full health. So those are the basics on the rubric of the goals of the destination holistic development. Here's another challenge for you. And we're going to pause the video for you to go and do a little answering in your learning journal and then come back. And here's the assignment. What is an existing assumption about teaching and learning that you carry that might not be the best way to reach holistic development for your students? What is some assumption that you have somewhere inside you that may not actually be the best way to achieve holistic development. Give you a couple of examples off the top of my head. The assumption that the best players get the status positions in orchestra seating. That's how the tradition goes. But is that really the most effective way for every student to develop holistically? Here's another one, an assumption. The best way to help students get better is to point out what they're doing wrong and praise them when they do it right. Certainly a very common assumption. Is that really the best way to get all students to develop holistically? In fact, we'll find out before long that giving praise is not always simply a good idea. And always pointing out what you're doing wrong may not build self-esteem the way holistic development requires. So, can you identify one assumption you hold that might not be the best way to holistically develop your students' outcomes? So, name that existing assumption you find somewhere in you concisely. Try naming an alternative assumption that seems more true, that might actually work better, and then write a couple of sentences about what it might look like in your practice teaching your students. Good luck. I'll see you back here just in 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Don't take too long with it. See you soon. Welcome back. Thank you for taking on these two activities in this asynchronous session. We're going to pause now. There'll be a little quiz afterwards that gets you to test out some of the ideas we introduced in this session so you can learn a little bit after our session. And we have quite a few gatherings together with you in this 1 week, 2 week time. So we'll see you again really soon, thinking about new assumptions and how they open up new possibilities. See you soon.